to another episode of Compliance Clips with your co-host Rick Morgan and myself, John Farquhar. Today, we have a super special guest. Interesting enough, he's from the West. We don't know how far west, but it's far enough west, it's west of here. And that's how we're going to introduce him as the guy from the West. We've got Robert Townsley, who's with Envista Forensics. So, Robert, give us a little bio on you and tell us, what's this Envista Forensic thing you work for?
So thanks for the introduction, John. Happy to be here. Happy to meet you guys. You guys are good folks. So Envista Forensics is basically a global multidisciplinary forensic engineering firm. We specialize in doing insurance and legal claims and lawsuit mitigation, essentially. I specialize myself in collision reconstruction, and I've been with Envista for about seven years at this point, and I've been doing collision reconstruction the whole time. Collision reconstruction is kind of like a branch of forensic investigations that focuses on kind of determining who's at fault in a motor vehicle accident. And I specialize in bicycle collisions, more commercial vehicle collisions, passenger vehicle collisions, ATVs, and everything in between.
Oh, wow. So anything that would hit a wall, you're going to investigate.
Absolutely, or hit each other. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So just for the audience, because I know there's going to be people that are going to go, "Ooh, this is cool." So, what does it take to become a forensics investigator in collision investigation? Obviously, more than knowing how to take pictures.
Absolutely, yeah. So a lot of people come from the criminal side. Like there's a lot of ex-police investigators that move into this civil side and kind of create their own firms and do their own investigations because, of course, there's a criminal aspect to it too, right? But I obviously work on the civil side, and my background, I have a mechanical engineering degree, and most of my competitors have the same kind of background with an engineering degree.
Cool. Well, Rick and I have been working on this series here where we're dealing with telematics, and we're talking about telematics, how to use it in your day-to-day usage as a motor carrier operating, in Canada, across Canada, in and out of the U.S. and whatnot. So, how does telematics play into what you're dealing with when you're investigating a commercial motor vehicle incident of sorts?
It's a good question, John. Telematics is also present in commercial vehicles, what we're going to talk about today, specifically when you have systems that are communicating from your vehicle to external networks. There's a lot of OEM, or aftermarket systems that can be retrofit onto a vehicle that can communicate with a fleet or safety manager's network. And those can provide like real-time data, real-time dash cam footage, real-time information to those fleet safety managers in case of a collision. And then they can also be accessed by investigators like myself after a collision to try and corroborate a story of a driver or a witness statement to discern what actually happened during the event of a crash. Like we can access data from the engine, we can access data from the anti-lock braking system module, we can access data from a plethora of modules in the vehicle, to be honest. And each of those data systems have different caveats for recording. They have different recording capabilities, different data sources, but they all kind of come towards one another to create a story, to kind of create a unified approach to doing collision analysis.
Wow. Okay.
And I'm just going to pick up on that thread because there's a little topic that's running through this telematics series that we're doing, which is, folks, if you're driving a truck, it's telling a story whether you're reading it or not.
Absolutely, especially now with the mandate for Canadian commercial vehicles after the model year 2000 to have ELDs. That's become a big thing, a new data source as well. That's kind of I wouldn't say newborn, but it's relatively new in sense of collision investigation because they weren't so common until they became mandatory this year.
Right. Well, and I was going to say a lot of these new commercial motor vehicles we're seeing, focusing mostly on the tractor, the truck itself. I'm hearing manufacturers talk that some of these vehicles have got over 100 computers, sensors, data points, and whatnot throughout this vehicle, and they're all recording some sort of information. So, as you'd mentioned, like even the ABS braking system, I'm assuming you could drill right down to a wheel end to find out which wheel end was operating properly, wasn't operating, and when it wasn't operating properly.
Yeah, correctly, because some of the anti-lock braking systems can actually record individual wheel speeds, right? And those individual wheel speeds are required for the ABS system to function properly, because it has to monitor each wheel speed, determine which one's slipping, which one isn't. And so those wheel speeds can be used to essentially identify if there's a fault or if there's an ABS issue that was contributing to the crash or as a result of the crash, pre or post impact. And there's just, like you said, there's tons of information, like, 100 Probably 100 is an understatement, to be honest. If we're talking sensors, if we're talking electric wiring harnesses, if we're talking modules, right? In a passenger vehicle, it's probably 100 to 200 to 300 set sources of information that are all feeding to different modules. In a commercial vehicle, it could be even more than that because they're much more complicated. They have all the additional towing capacity and additional weight management systems that are on there.
Right. And then you've got trailers that have different systems and functionalities in those trailers. So that.
Yes, trailers have rollover stability modules in some instances, right?
Yep.
So Robert, why don't you take us through a day in Robert's life? What happens when you get called out for an accident reconstruction? Why don't you share with us what it looks like when you go out there, what you're accessing, how you're downloading it? I know one of the things that we talked about before was making sure that you can access the ECM because some manufacturers have limited service providers to get that information. Why don't you share with us?
So basically the main sources of data we're looking at are, like you said, ECMs, ABS modules, specifically the Bendix module, and collision mitigation systems. There are some tertiary systems you can get data from, such as like ELD that I previously mentioned, external GPS data loggers that could be in there, or some dash cam systems like Samsara, Lytix, Keep Trucking, Go Motive, things like that. So for involved insurance or if a lawyer hires us, if they kind of know what data we need and how to retain us early, we can get to the truck early and do a download. And, there's two ways to do downloads, or I guess I should say three. The main one is just basically plugging into the vehicle through its Deutsch connector, just under the steering wheel, right? You can access the ECM data through that. You can access the ABS data through that as well. The tertiary information like GPS or Samsara data, you have to get that from fleet safety managers or from the module itself. But for the most part, on Detroit diesel engines, Cummins engines, Caterpillar engines, you can just plug directly into the vehicle. And you're looking at specifically getting data related to something called hard stop or hard brake or fast stop or sudden deceleration events. They're all interchangeable names. And essentially that data is related to a change in wheel speed that allows a vehicle to record data. And that wheel speed is a threshold that's set within the vehicle manufacturer's software. And so if that threshold is met, it'll record data. That data can be, up to 60 seconds before crash, up to 90 seconds before crash at 1 hertz intervals, so 1 instance per second. We're recording speed data. We're recording brake pedal status, accelerator pedal status, cruise control status, engine RPM, right? All that information is being recorded once per second. And in Volvos, you can get that 4 times per second even. And then all that's up towards the trigger point where it meets that threshold of wheel speed change. And that is about 15 to 15 seconds after the crash that also records data. So you really have a good chronology of information that you get from these hard stop events. There's also other data from the ECM. You can get something called last stop data. Not as useful as hard stop because it's not necessarily related to a crash event such as a hard brake would be because you're expecting a sudden wheel speed change to get that hard brake data. Last stop is exactly what it sounds like. It's like when the wheel speed reaches 0, data is collected and data is recorded. So you can imagine you're driving along a road and you're even like regular day-to-day driving, no crash, no collision event of interest. You stop at a red light, you're recording last stop data. You accelerate, now you go to another red light, you stop, you overwrite the previous last stop event because there's only one spot for storage. Now you create a new event, right? So when you're trying to access that data for collision purposes or investigative purposes, if the truck is moved or driven or powered on, or the drive shaft senses a wheel speed change because it's being towed or something, then that data from the last stop events can be overwritten. So it's very rare, if not ever, that I've been able to use that information to crash. Only in the rare instances where the vehicle is so destroyed and so damaged after the crash where it can't be driven and can't be turned on.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So this kind of really opens up a whole bunch of questions, but got to be careful because we don't want to go down a rabbit hole by any means. But nonetheless, the key aspect obviously is I need that data as soon as possible, even though I may not have a case or anything that we're going to go to. But one of the things that we know is with your organization, and we've talked to Lars Daniel about this, is that cell phone situation almost needs to be treated the same way. If we can lock down the data as soon as possible, then we can preserve it for the possible opportunity of whether it be a claim, a criminal case, or a civil case in that manner, which can make it helpful. So obviously getting a phone call from the insurance company going, hey, we need somebody on site now.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's exactly the same as cell phones in the sense that cell phone data is not permanent, it's temporary, right? So it's
Right,
always best,
right.
like you said, to get that data at the onset, just for the purposes of preservation, right? Doing the download itself isn't too cost prohibitive. Obviously, there's a bit of a cost associated with it, but
Mhm.
even just gather data at the onset and storing it in a digital file forever, and then you have
Right,
it just for
right.
peace of mind.
Sure. Right.
Okay,
And
so just a second here, you've got a whole bunch of ones and zeros that you've downloaded, and it's like X here, Y there. What does Robert do to turn all these X's and O's and ones and zeros into a recreation? How can you take all that data and then sit in a court and say, this is what happened?
Well, the software, wasn't developed for the purposes of us, but it's been sufficiently validated in lots of literature, lots of research to show that it's valid, right? And so to answer your question, Rick, basically, the data will come in a huge table, like it's already kind of formatted in that sense, right? And you put that into analysis software, whether it's like I typically just use Excel software. I use a software called PC Crash, which is simulation software. You can analyze sequence tables in there, and essentially you're just doing kind of integration or differentiating the speed data to get distance. And then once you get the speed data, you can differentiate that and get acceleration. And so you can know when the vehicle's braking, you know how far the vehicle's traveling from its speed. That speed data is good. That speed data can be used for, distance and acceleration calculations. And then you can basically kind of build a chronology or like a timeline or a map of where the truck is 3 seconds before impact, where it is 1 second before impact, where it is 25 seconds before impact if you're going back that far, right? And you can essentially identify when the driver begins to brake, when the driver releases the accelerator pedal, when he releases the cruise control button lever, right? And then when you have that story, you corroborate it with the intersecting vehicle or the colliding vehicle. If they also have an EDR that you can download, you can corroborate their story and kind of work them back 5-10 seconds, whatever data you have. And then you can kind of work the vehicles towards one another and see when the drivers were able to perceive each other as a hazard. Maybe there's a tree at the intersection or a big building that, impeded their ability to see one another. So then as soon as they become visible after this obstruction, you see the brake pedal applied, right? You can kind of build a story based on that and understand why the collision happened and discern whether it was avoidable or if it was truly an accident and not avoidable.
Mm.
So there's
So
a certain amount here where the impressions or the memories of the guys and girls who may have been in control of the vehicle can either be contradicted or confirmed based on actual scientific data. Is
That's
this
exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. So
we're
I've done
removing that subjective or the subjective portion of the crash and turning it purely objective data?
That's exactly correct. Yeah. So that I have a presentation based solely on that, which is like reliability of witness information. And I have a bunch of case studies where it's like, this is what person A says, and this is what their vehicle says, right?
Yeah,
People don't know
exactly.
how long a car length is. You ask but people what a car length is, and you look at questioning transcripts where lawyers are asking people, how many car lengths behind the person were you, or behind the vehicle were you? They'll say 3 car lengths, and they'll say, okay, so that's 15 meters. They're like, no, it's more like 12 feet, which is about 4 meters. That's not even one length of a car, right? So
Hmm.
people are
Hmm.
notoriously unreliable, and it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
necessarily a fault of their own. It's their own truth. They've created truth
sure.
to what they understood happened, and you kind of put yourself in their shoes. And you understand that the collision occurs in a tenth of a second.
So I get a question with regards to the impact. So, what tools are you utilizing for determining the time or when that impact actually took place? So I'm going to play devil's advocate here because we've got these computers that can recognize when the brake pedal was applied, when the wheels started to slow down. Um, but how do we know when the impact was? What is there sensors? Is there something that tells us that we've made contact with another vehicle?
It's a really good question, John, because that's something that differs significantly between commercial vehicle reconstruction and passenger vehicle reconstruction. Even if you
Right.
have functional ABS, you will get some indication of braking if it was severe
Yep.
enough, right? Because you have the
Right.
intermediate lockup, so you have like the intermittent brake mark.
Mhm.
And so if you can kind of corroborate a story between skid marks, either pre or post impact, or maybe a change in skid mark or creation of skid mark, for example, like say they're hitting a passenger vehicle and the passenger vehicle moves sideways, right? And that creates a skid mark on the roadway from that passenger vehicle. And the truck hit that at a certain angle. So you say that's where they are at the roadway. But now you have the story of trying to create that position of the roadway to the EDR data you downloaded, right? And so if you
Mhm.
saw braking begin, say after the trigger, right? Like brake pedal wasn't activated and then there's this big speed loss, and now the brake pedal's on, that indicates post-impact braking because they wouldn't sustain that speed loss without braking.
Right.
So in that
right.
case, the time 0 is pretty much indicative of impact, right? And
Yep.
if you have brake pedal before the time 0, say they're braking for 3-4 seconds, and then the time 0 occurs, you get that big wheel speed loss. We know
Yep.
they broke before, so we're looking for pre-impact skid marks. Maybe we can corroborate that. And if we don't have any skid marks because it wasn't significant enough braking, or if they had ABS systems on the vehicle, then we can try and see how significant that speed loss was that caused the deceleration event to occur. And if the speed loss is something that's not possible by regular braking, right? So heavy truck typically brake at, within a good ABS system, they can get up to maybe 1G. That's probably a bit too high, maybe about 0.7, 0.85 G for a heavy truck. And so if I have, like I said, I have the speeds, so I can differentiate those and get the acceleration. And if I calculate the acceleration value to be well above that 0.7 or 0.85 G, that's possible for the truck to brake by itself, then that time indicates impact. And the same thing, if that's kind of before or after impact, I can kind of decide where that's where impact occurs.
Right. Okay, that's cool. Because I've read some different articles on, some of the outcomes of a particular crash, and one in particular sticks in my mind that took place in Florida, and this is a few years ago, where they were able to determine that the driver did not actually apply the brakes until half a second before impact, and it was like, holy precise, like, you know. So, and it was like, how did they determine that? Now you've explained how that's determined, so it's interesting.
All right, and with that note, we are going to take a break and pause between part 1 and part 2, our interview with Robert Townsley. I hope you're enjoying this one so far. Please be sure to join us next week when we pick up exactly where we left off and we get into even more detail of how crash reconstructionists take the data that's already in your vehicle and being recorded, whether you know it or not, and can tell the story of exactly what happened right up to the fraction of a second before impact. Compliance Clips is a joint production of Summit Risk Solutions and Links Consulting. Thanks so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you in our next release. Take care.